May 7th, 1945. Victory in Europe. Across the world, crowds flooded the streets. Men in uniform kissed strangers. Flags waved from every window. The nightmare of Nazi Germany was finally over. But inside the White House, celebration felt wrong. Behind closed doors, the air was tense, heavy, silent. America's new president, Harry S. Truman, sat in the Oval Office, surrounded by men who still called another man boss. He looked around the room, then said something that froze everyone in place. "From this moment on," Truman said quietly, "I don't want to hear that name in this building." For a moment, no one spoke. His press secretary, Charlie Ross, broke the silence. "Which name, sir?" Truman's jaw tightened. "You know damn well which name." The order was clear. Roosevelt, Franklin, FDR, all of it gone. Outside, the nation still mourned the man who had led them through depression and war. Franklin Roosevelt was a hero, a saint in the eyes of millions. Inside the Oval Office, his successor had just buried his name. The command spread quietly through the corridors of power. Staffers whispered it to each other like a secret curse. "Don't mention Roosevelt. Not unless you have to." They called it the unspoken rule. For the next 6 months, Roosevelt's name vanished from everyday life inside the White House. Speeches avoided it. Memos rewrote it. The staff learned to speak around a ghost, but no one understood why. Why would Truman, the man who owed his presidency to Roosevelt's death, forbid even his name? Was it bitterness, jealousy, or something deeper, something that had been buried with Roosevelt himself? That mystery would haunt the next half year of Truman's life, and the answer would reveal one of the most personal and painful rivalries in American history. The morning after Truman's command, a strange quiet settled over the West Wing. Secretaries hesitated before speaking. Cabinet members paused before referencing the past. No one wanted to be the first to test the president's patience. In meeting rooms once filled with Roosevelt's booming voice, there was now only restraint. People spoke in circles, replacing the forbidden name with vague phrases. The previous administration, earlier leadership, or simply before. New staffers, unaware of the unwritten rule, quickly learned it the hard way. One young aide, fresh from the War Department, proudly cited a Roosevelt policy during a briefing. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. A senior advisor gave him a sharp look, a silent warning. Later that day, someone took the young man aside and whispered, "If you value your career, don't ever say that name in front of the president again." Outside the White House gates, Roosevelt's portrait hung in every post office, every city hall, every newspaper headline. His legacy was everywhere except in the one building he had ruled for 12 years. Reporters noticed the shift. At press conferences, Truman never mentioned Roosevelt unless he absolutely had to. When asked about continuing Roosevelt's vision, Truman's answers were short, clipped, and careful. He said he respected the late president, but his tone was always tight, like someone holding his breath. Inside the Oval Office, even personal spaces bore the tension. Roosevelt's favorite naval paintings were quietly removed. His chair was replaced. His personal pens and papers locked away in the archives. To visitors, it looked like a simple redecorating, but those who worked there every day could feel it, the deliberate erasure of a ghost who refused to leave. Some staff pitied Truman. Others feared him. A few thought the ban was an overreaction, a sign that the new president wasn't ready for the weight of the office. But none of them knew what Truman had already discovered: the private notes, the hidden letters, the doubts Roosevelt had left behind. Each new discovery was salt in an open wound, and while the world cheered the end of one war, inside the White House, a different kind of battle was beginning. A quiet, personal war between two presidents, one alive, one dead, and the silence that separated them. By early May, the strain on Truman was visible. He had been president for less than a month, and already he looked years older. Every decision on his desk seemed to carry the weight of the world. Ending the war with Japan, managing a fragile alliance with Stalin, and deciphering the Manhattan Project that Roosevelt had never fully explained. He worked 18 hours a day, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and stubborn willpower. Yet everywhere he turned, someone reminded him of the man he replaced. Mr. President, when Roosevelt handled this, President Roosevelt always said, FDR believed. It was relentless. Every sentence began with a ghost. Every comparison felt like a wound reopening. On May 6th, the day before victory in Europe, the tension finally snapped. The cabinet gathered to discuss post-war plans for Germany. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, one of Roosevelt's most loyal men, laid out a plan to strip Germany of its industry, to reduce the nation to farmland so it could never threaten Europe again. He called it the Morgenthau Plan, and every argument he made began the same way. President Roosevelt believed Germany must be punished severely. President Roosevelt agreed with me. President Roosevelt wanted. That was the moment Truman's patience died. He slammed his hand on the table. President Roosevelt is dead, he said sharply. And I think your plan is insane. The room fell silent. Morgenthau froze, eyes wide. Truman rose from his chair. It would leave 50 million Germans starving, easy prey for communists. It would destabilize Europe for generations. Meeting adjourned. And with that, he walked out. No one followed him. What his cabinet saw that day was anger. But what they didn't see was the storm behind it. The sleepless nights, the secret memos, and the betrayal Truman had just uncovered in Roosevelt's own handwriting. That evening, long after the corridors emptied, his press secretary Charlie Ross found him alone in the dark, a glass of bourbon on the desk, Roosevelt's old papers spread before him. The desk that once belonged to FDR had become a battlefield, and somewhere in those folders lay the reason Truman would never speak his predecessor's name again. That night, Washington slept. But inside the Oval Office, a single lamp still burned. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows betrayal. Truman sat alone, sleeves rolled up, a glass of bourbon untouched beside him. He had been digging through Roosevelt's old desk for weeks, trying to make sense of the scattered papers his predecessor left behind. What he found that evening would haunt him for years. In a drawer marked Personal, Truman discovered a thin folder titled Concerns Regarding the Vice President. It was dated February 1945, just 2 months before Roosevelt's death. The handwriting was unmistakable. Inside were 3 pages. 3 pages that burned more than any battlefield report. Roosevelt had written that his vice president, Harry S. Truman, was a small-minded machine politician from Missouri, lacking the intellect and vision required for world leadership. He questioned Truman's fitness for office, suggesting that the Democratic Party should consider replacing him on the 1948 ticket. Truman read the words again and again. Each sentence hit like a physical blow. The man he'd spent his career admiring, the man the nation worshipped, had written him off as unworthy, unprepared, unimportant. He pushed the papers aside, trembling. For the first time in his life, Harry Truman hated the name Franklin Roosevelt. When Charlie Ross, his lifelong friend and press secretary, entered the room, he found Truman staring into nothing. Ross asked softly, "What happened, Harry?" Truman didn't look up. He simply pointed to the folder. "Do you know what I found tonight, Charlie? A letter from that man, the one they all say I should honor." He paused, voice shaking. "He called me a fool, said I wasn't fit to sit in this chair." Ross tried to speak, but Truman cut him off. "Do you know what's worse? He might have been right." He picked up the folder and threw it across the desk. Papers scattered like white birds in the dim light. Then Truman whispered, more to himself than to Ross, "That son of a gun left me a job I was never meant to finish and made sure everyone knew it." Outside, the city was celebrating peace. Inside the Oval Office, Truman was declaring a different kind of war, a private one, against the ghost of the man who had just humiliated him from beyond the grave. Days turned into nights, and Truman kept searching through Roosevelt's papers like a man possessed. He wasn't looking for gossip, he was looking for clarity. But the deeper he looked, the darker the truth became. Among the sealed correspondence files, he found a series of letters marked Eyes Only, FDR. The signatures were familiar: Stalin's bold scrawl, Churchill's careful script. And what those letters contained made Truman's stomach twist. In private exchanges never shown to Congress, Roosevelt had promised Stalin something staggering: the Soviet Union's dominance over Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, in return for Soviet help against Japan. No official record of these promises existed. They weren't in the public Yalta agreements. These were secret commitments, written between two men who believed they alone could shape the post-war world. Truman sat back in disbelief. He realized that half of Europe's fate had been traded away in letters he was never meant to read, and now he was the one expected to honor them. Worse still, other documents revealed that Roosevelt had deliberately excluded him from all of it. Orders, memos, handwritten notes. Do not brief the vice president. He doesn't need to know yet. Keep him out until after the conference. Every page confirmed what Truman already feared. His predecessor had never trusted him, never respected him, never even considered him part of the circle that ruled the world. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, the anger building behind his eyes. Roosevelt hadn't just left him unprepared, he'd left him trapped, bound by secret deals he never agreed to, forced to choose between exposing the truth or maintaining the illusion of unity. The decision crushed him. If he revealed Roosevelt's private concessions, he would shatter the alliance holding the world together. If he stayed silent, he would inherit promises he believed were dangerous and wrong. For hours, Truman sat in that chair, staring at the papers. The war in Europe was over, but another one, a colder, quieter one, was already beginning, and he was standing at its front line. That night, as dawn crept through the curtains, he gathered the letters, sealed them in a folder, and locked them in the desk. Then he whispered to himself, "So this is what I inherited, a victory wrapped in lies." When he finally turned off the light, one thing was clear. The ban on Roosevelt's name wasn't just an act of anger anymore. It was an act of survival, a wall between Truman and the man whose shadow could destroy him. Morning light spilled through the Oval Office windows, but for Truman, the dawn brought no peace. The letters were locked away, yet their weight still pressed on his chest. He had seen too much truths that could never be spoken. The world outside worshipped Roosevelt as a savior. To question him was unthinkable. The newspapers called him the man who saved democracy. How could Truman, the man who owed his presidency to Roosevelt's death, reveal that the hero had left behind a web of secrets and promises that might tear the world apart? He couldn't, not without destroying himself. And maybe the country. So he did the only thing he could. He smiled for the cameras. He spoke Roosevelt's name once, only once, in his victory address. A single line, carefully measured. President Roosevelt did not live to see this day, but we know he shares in our victory. Then nothing more. Reporters noticed. Editorials accused Truman of being ungrateful, of failing to honor the man who built the arsenal of democracy. But inside, Truman burned. He didn't owe Roosevelt gratitude. He owed him silence. Inside the White House, the ban became absolute. Staff called it the bubble, a strange, invisible boundary where Roosevelt's memory simply didn't exist. Meetings avoided his name, with speeches deleted it. Even small talk carried the risk of crossing an invisible line. Memos began to replace Roosevelt's policy with vague phrases, previous directives, earlier plans. Cabinet members whispered warnings to new arrivals. Don't mention him, not even by accident. Eleanor Roosevelt visited the White House several times that summer, to collect belongings, to discuss the United Nations. Truman greeted her with perfect courtesy, but every conversation was suffocating. They circled each other politely, each aware of the name neither dared to say. When she left, Truman stood by the window, watching her car disappear. He whispered to himself, "Even his widow deserves better than the truth." The nation saw a confident new president. But behind that calm expression was a man walking a tightrope, trapped between protecting a legend and cleaning up its mess. For Truman, leadership no longer meant command. It meant restraint, the discipline of a man who must swallow the truth to keep the peace. By June 1945, the ban had become legend inside the White House. Nobody questioned it anymore. It was simply the rule. The name Roosevelt was gone, buried under silence and fear. But ghosts have a way of returning, even when unspoken. One morning, a young State Department aide entered the Oval Office, nervous but eager to impress. He began his briefing on the Soviet situation. "Mr. President, at Yalta," President Roosevelt agreed to. Truman's head snapped up. The aide froze. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. Then Truman's voice cut through the air like glass. "I've read the Yalta agreements. Tell me what they want now, not what Roosevelt promised then." The young man stammered, tried to recover, but Truman stood abruptly. "Are you deaf?" I said. "Tell me what they're demanding now." The meeting ended in seconds. The aide left pale, shaken. By the next day, everyone in Washington knew. Mention Roosevelt's name in front of Truman, and you were finished. Even casual references vanished. Staff would say, "Before the change, the previous team, the earlier direction." It was a language of avoidance, a careful choreography to keep a dead man's name from re-entering the room. But silence did not erase the ghost. If anything, it made it louder. Every time Truman entered the cabinet room, he could still feel Roosevelt's presence, his laughter echoing in the walls, his cigarette smoke clinging to the drapes, his portraits watching from the corridors. Sometimes, late at night, Truman walked those halls alone, past the photos and paintings his staff hadn't yet removed. He would stop before one, Roosevelt smiling confidently beside Churchill and Stalin, and mutter under his breath, "You made this world, Franklin. Now I have to live in it." He was angry, yes, but beneath the anger was something else. A deep, exhausted grief. He didn't just hate Roosevelt. He missed the man he once believed in. And that mix of admiration and resentment would follow him into every decision he made that summer. The ghost of Franklin Roosevelt was no longer just a memory. It was a mirror showing Truman everything he feared he was not. By July 1945, the world had changed again. Germany had surrendered, but peace was already splintering, a new kind of tension creeping across Europe. The Soviets occupied half the continent, and Stalin's ambitions were no longer hidden behind wartime smiles. For the first time since taking office, Truman felt something close to clarity. The 6 months of humiliation, the sleepless nights, the whispers about Roosevelt, they had hardened him. Now he would face the world not as Roosevelt's heir, but as his own man. When he arrived in Germany for the Potsdam Conference, the air itself felt heavy with history. Stalin sat across the table, expression unreadable. Churchill, and later Clement Attlee, after Britain's election, flanked him on the other side. Every man in that room had known Roosevelt. Every one of them expected Truman to follow his predecessor's script. They were wrong. When Stalin demanded sweeping reparations from Germany and insisted on controlling Eastern Europe as a zone of security, Truman pushed back hard. He didn't smile, didn't flatter, didn't dance around the issue. "You're dealing with me now," he said flatly. "And I didn't make those promises." Stalin blinked, surprised. Churchill raised an eyebrow. Even the American delegation shifted in their seats. Later, Stalin was overheard telling an interpreter, "This one has a spine." It was the moment Truman stepped out from Roosevelt's shadow. He was no longer the uncertain vice president from Missouri. He was the man who carried the final word of the world's most powerful nation. The press noticed, too. Papers back home called his tone firm, unyielding. Others criticized him for abandoning Roosevelt's vision of cooperation. Truman read the headlines, jaw clenched. They still compared him to a ghost, but this time he didn't care. When he returned to Washington, he was different. The fear was gone. The hesitation, the bitterness, the need to prove himself gone too. He knew the war's final act was coming. And when the decision came whether to use a weapon no man had ever unleashed, he didn't ask, what would Roosevelt do? He simply said, proceed. That single word would change the world and finally, forever, set Truman apart from the man who once made him feel small. October 1945. 6 months had passed since Truman's unspoken order. The war was over. The world had changed, and so had he. He had faced Stalin, ended the bloodiest conflict in history, and made choices no man before him ever had. For the first time, The comparisons to Roosevelt began to fade. People no longer saw him as the accidental president. They saw him as Harry Truman, the man who made the hardest calls and lived with them. Inside the White House, the silence around Roosevelt's name began to lift. The staff stopped whispering. Cabinet members no longer froze before speaking of the past. And one afternoon, while preparing a speech for a Democratic Party event, Truman read a line written by one of his aides. President Roosevelt built the foundation of victory. We are harvesting what he planted. Truman hesitated. Then, quietly, he nodded. Keep it, he said. That was the first public acknowledgement in half a year. It wasn't praise. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acceptance. He had learned something that Roosevelt never had. That power wasn't about being worshipped. It was about endurance. To stand in the wreckage, make choices no one else would, and carry the weight of them without complaint, that was leadership. In the years that followed, Truman rarely spoke of Roosevelt again, but in his private letters, the wound still showed. He called Roosevelt a great president, but a poor teacher, a man who could save a nation but break the people closest to him. When asked decades later if he admired Roosevelt, Truman paused, then said, I respected what he did for America, but I'll never forget how he treated me. He didn't need to. By then, history had already drawn the line. Roosevelt built the myth. Truman carried the burden. And for 6 months, in 1945, he taught the world that even the most powerful man alive sometimes needs silence. Not out of pettiness, but to remember he's still human.